Thank you for joining us here. You're in the first of two meetings for the Sacramento revisions to vehicle and bicycle parking requirements. This is follow up to some of our community conversations that we had earlier in the year. So it's really great to see some faces back in the mix here. On this next slide, as we still have some people who are joining us, you're going to see that I know that we've been in Zoom for quite a while now, but it's always great to go over our little Zoom instructions. So you might have noticed that everyone has been muted upon entry. That's to help us keep the background noise and to get through the presentation without any interruptions. The chat box is open for your comments, for your questions. If you want to introduce yourself, feel free to let your presence known in there. We'll have it open during the entire meeting so you can make sure that you can have your questions in there. We'll have plenty of time at the end to go through those questions, so don't you worry, we'll make sure we have time for that. The second thing is that we are recording this meeting this morning. We want to make sure that anybody who has missed any of these meetings can see it on our project website. So in the next week or two, we should have both the presentation and the video from this workshop onto the project website. So again, if you have any other questions, just let us know. But on this next slide, we'll go through a little bit of our agenda. So I'm going to take a few minutes just to go through some introductions. Then we're going to bring the team up to go through some of our project recommendations. As I mentioned, we've saved at least about 30 minutes at the end for a great question and answer session. So feel free to put your questions into the chat, save them from them, but we'll make sure that we'll have plenty of time to get to them there. And then finally, we'll leave you with some of the next steps for the project, get you the contact information for the city directly. So if you have any comments and questions, you can reach out to us at any time moving forward. All right, this next slide, let's get to know who you might be hearing from today. And so from the city of Sacramento, we have the Community Development Department, we have the Public Works Department. From the consultant team, we have W-Trans, we have Nelson Nygaard with AIM Consulting and Strategic Economics. And so with these, I'm going to actually assign some names to it just so we know who we are. My name's Katie DeMeo. I'm with AIM Consulting. With the city of Sacramento, you're going to hear from Vic Randall, who's a senior planner here in a moment. We also have Ryan Dodge on our project team. He's an associate planner. From W-Trans, you're going to hear from Brian Campia. He'll be on in just a moment, and so he'll be able to give his presentation there. And so on this next slide here is the last thing you'll be hearing from me until you hear from the project team. But if you were at one of my community meetings, we would usually have you answer this on your registration or when you sign in. So we would love to know, where are you coming from here in Sacramento? Are you coming from the city, Central City, East Sacramento, Land Park? Do you represent the Pocket? South Sacramento, Elmhurst, Oak Park, Natomas. If you do not see yourself represented in the list, please be sure that you put yourself in the chat box. All right. It looks like we have a good representation from Central City, about 32% again. So we have about 75% of people who have answered. Julie just put in Central City, downtown, midtown. But let me end this poll. Let me share the results real quick and let us know where we're at. So we have about 30% coming from the Central City, about 17% from East Sac, 9% from Land Park, some representation from Pocket and Elmhurst, Oak Park, another 22% from Natomas. And then we'll check out the chat box to see who else we have here. And so again, looks like we have some people from Arden Arcade as well. And so that's it for me until the question and answer session, but it's my pleasure to turn this over to Vic with the city of Sacramento.
All right, thank you so much, Katie. And I would also like to note that we're joined by Stacy Hovermill of the Public Works Parking Services Division. She is the Parking Services Division Manager. So I just want to go ahead and give a little bit of background on the policy direction that's led us to this work. So the work on this parking strategy began prior to the adoption of the 2040 General Plan and Climate Action and Adaptation Plan this past February. Initially, the project was scoped to consider parking minimums. However, the removal of parking minimum requirements was adopted as a general plan policy and therefore took effect as of March 2024. The parking strategy therefore focuses on parking maximums, bicycle parking requirements, and the parking management toolkit. And the parking strategy is rooted in policy direction included in the city's housing element to explore instituting parking maximums along established transit corridors. The Climate Action and Adaptation Plan also includes policy direction to develop parking maximums and require parking management based on available transportation options and land use. The 2040 General Plan includes a wide range of related policy recommendations, key among them including managing parking supply to align with objectives for reduced vehicle miles traveled, improving air quality, supporting economic vitality, and fostering a high quality of life throughout the city. The general plan also calls for the continued deployment of a parking management strategy that optimizes the use of the existing parking supply, minimizes the need for the construction of new parking facilities, and promotes shifting trips from single occupancy vehicles to biking, walking, public transit, and high occupancy vehicles. Some of the key objectives for this work include reducing development costs to support the provision of more housing, better managing and utilizing our on-street and off-street parking supply, improving the cost effectiveness of parking infrastructure in the city, and supporting the development of an urban form that enables more Sacramentans to choose transit and active transportation for more of their daily trips. If you could go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So the city has made the public review draft parking strategy available for public comment directly in the document via the online community workshop, which can be accessed through the website listed here. The webpage link will also be shared in the chat. Please note that comments can be submitted by email through City Council consideration in early 2025, but the city will close the online community workshop on December 2nd. The project team will then evaluate comments received by that deadline to guide revisions for the final draft parking strategy, which will be brought forward for commission and council review in early 2025. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the presentation over to Brian Canepa, the project manager from W-Trans.
All right, thank you, Vic. I'm Brian Canepa from W-Trans. Happy to be here today and see so many faces showing up here in the morning. We're going to be going through today, pardon me. And I'll start out with a little bit of background on the project. I appreciate Vic going and giving a little history on the policy piece of this. I wanted to start out by saying that not only has there been city direction, city policy changing over time, but as part of this project, we are cognizant of state legislation that has taken effect within the past year or two. Specifically, AB 2097 is one of the largest ones. So this took effect in January of 23 and essentially eliminated at the time minimum parking requirements for a good chunk of the city, 44% to be exact. Those are the blue bubbles that you see here on the chart. So the city is actually, a bulk of the city has actually been living without minimum parking requirements now for almost 2 years. AB 2097 also allows for the city to require by right that any parking provided within those half-mile areas either be shared, i.e. publicly accessible, priced, or include car share vehicles. So, these sorts of topics will come up again as we move through our recommendations. But just a little bit of note that it's not only local policy that's been changing, but also state. So as Vic mentioned in our project description here, this is really kind of a big rethink of the city's vehicle and bicycle parking requirements and how parking management is conducted. I had the pleasure of working with the city about a decade ago, updating the parking code at the time, and this is kind of taking everything to the next step and keeping it in line with best practices that are occurring across the country. So not only in terms of eliminating minimum parking requirements and establishing maximums, but also really addressing how parking is managed on street, because we're very cognizant of the fact that any changes that we make to off-street parking policy and regulations has an immediate impact on street. And in addition, that this is not simply about vehicles. I mean motor vehicles. That we're also cognizant of the fact that the standards that the city has for bicycles, are potentially need to be changed to accommodate other micromobility devices, e-bikes, cargo bikes, scooters, and things of that sort. And so really, the idea today is to gather your input and feedback on these parking mobility recommendations. Again, I'll reiterate too what Vic said is, we, as a primary source, we would really love everyone to go on to Conveo and put your comments and thoughts in there. It gives us a nice comprehensive written list of everyone's feedback, but obviously welcome your feedback here as well as any questions in particular that come up. Oh, and I will note too, as for questions, we will hold all questions until the Q&A period after the presentation. But the project schedule, so we kicked this off, just a bit of history here, in fall of 23, so it's been about a year. We've gone through several rounds of our, what we call essentially our working group. It's a technical advisory committees, working with them as well as holding targeted community conversations during the winter of 23 and 24. As you can see where the box is now, we are in fall of 24 holding our broader community meetings along with the public draft of the report. After we get all of the feedback and the comment period closes, we will be kind of putting our noses to the grindstone again, revising the plan based on that, and we'll have a final draft here in the coming months for adoption later this winter. So diving in and kind of the methodology here, and we'll start with the vehicle parking code reforms first. So as Vic mentioned, I mean, all this is being driven by city policy. I mean, very strongly by the general plan, but also by the housing element and climate action plan as well. But at the end of the day, the recommendations that we have come out with as part of this are very data driven. The graphics shown here are kind of relative rudimentary data having to do with vehicle ownership by geography throughout the city, vehicle ownership data by income. We want to be very cognizant of equity issues when putting forward either parking or parking management recommendations. We also worked with the city to, and I really have to thank the city for this, actually compiling at least 5 years worth of development data of every project that's been approved in the city, supplying us with all the parking data that was associated with that. So we have a firm understanding of how much parking, both vehicle and bicycle, various developments across the city have provided before the pandemic to today, to actually get a good sense of actual market demand and what we see from the central city out to more suburban parts of the city. So diving in on the strategies themselves, and again, these are quick summaries of everything that's included in the report. So I'll feel free if you want more detail to look in the report, but I'm covering all the key highlights here. So looking at the parking requirements here, previously the city was broken up, the entire city was broken up into various districts. With the elimination of minimum parking requirements, just again, keep that in mind, the entire city now has no minimum parking requirements. We're really focused on maximum parking requirements and where those should take effect. And the general plan is very specific on this, that these maximum parking requirements should apply only within a half a mile of existing high-frequency transit stops. And when we say high-frequency transit stops, we mean essentially the rail lines that run through the city, as well as a couple of the high-frequency bus lines, the RT bus lines. So we stood back at this and talked with different community members about how we could structure this. And we came up with this map of the 2 zones that we've essentially designated for maximum parking requirements. One being the central city, which is kind of the dark red color, and the other, I would say the kind of light sort of orangish red color, are half a mile walking distance from high frequency transit stops outside the central city. And we tiered it in this way because we had heard considerable amount of feedback from a variety of people saying that, the central city itself really operates differently than the rest of the city in terms of transit access, walkability, density, and so forth. It has a different set of characteristics associated with it, and standards should be reflective of that. And so all the data that I mentioned previously, we really actually honed it in on these areas to make it as context sensitive as possible. And so the maximum requirements that we're recommending as part of this plan, as you can see, are broken into central city, half a mile walk of existing high frequency transit, again, the areas outside of the central city, and then the rest of city. The rest of city is included in there because, as you can see with the asterisk, the city code already has some maximum parking requirements associated with it. In fact, even within the central business district right now, the maximum parking requirement, for example, for residential is 1 per unit. So we've essentially expanded that from the central business district, which is a pretty tight core of the downtown, to the central city, the broader central city. And I'll say this, that when we approached these numbers, we were looking very, very closely at all the data that had been supplied to us by the city to say, what will the impact be of these recommendations? Will developments feel as if they want to provide significantly more parking, or are these really relatively reasonable? And we definitely erred on the side of being relatively conservative, so that the vast majority of developments that have been built in previous years would continue to be built with some limited exceptions here and there. So for example, in the central city, 1 space per unit, going to 1.5 spaces per unit outside the central city, only within these half-mile areas. And if you say, gosh, what does this mean for the rest of the city? If there's a dash right there, it means no maximums. That's just how to interpret that. So one of the questions that came up too is, well, what if we do have developments that for whatever reason would like to exceed those maximums? Should there be some sort of flexibility built in? And so we're recommending a provision as part of the code that developments can exceed through administrative permit process the maximums by 25%. So if I'm a developer and I want to go from 1 space to 1.25 spaces per unit, I'm allowed to do that with the understanding that those excess spaces that are provided would be publicly accessible. So that if there is going to be an excess beyond the maximum, that there is a public benefit associated with that. In addition, an additional 25% could be added onto that, but that would be through a review process with the city. So the idea is that there are maximums in place, but there is flexibility to exceed that if community benefits are provided, if there is a certain city level of city review associated with that. And again, we're drawing on also best practices from around the country who have kind of similar processes in place. The third has to do with unbundled parking pricing. So for those of you who are not familiar with this concept, unbundled parking pricing is essentially a fancy way of saying that you separate the cost of parking from the lease or ownership costs of a residential unit or non-residential. So that if you are going to, for example, rent an apartment, you're not required to rent a parking space if you don't have a car. The cost of the parking space is the same, but it just separates the cost out for that person so that if someone does not wish to have a parking spot, they're not compelled to buy one. State legislation, AB 1317, has already been passed that will mandate unbundled parking for all rental housing with 16 or more units. That will be taking effect. What this does is require it more broadly for any new or converted residential buildings over a few units. So it has to be multi-unit at the end of the day. But also requiring that it be unreserved in order to really maximize the efficiency of it. But really with an attention paid to, this is really an equity measure so that people who do not have cars, who are lower income, whatever the case happens to be, that they're not compelled to pay for something that they're not using. Per state law, these also cannot be applied to affordable housing or to tenants with federal housing choice vouchers. So that's just a limitation within the state law. The fourth recommendation here has to do with shared parking. So as I mentioned, per AB 2097, the city by right now can require that any development within a half a mile of those kind of blue bubbles that I showed you earlier, major transit stops, can mandate that developments provide car sharing, have publicly accessible spaces, or price their parking. And this recommendation essentially goes a little bit further to say that this should not only be effective in those major transit stop areas, but also outside of it. In talking with parking services in the city, I think the feeling is that this sort of option would be used very sparingly in only extreme cases where it really made sense to pull that lever. But to give the city the flexibility in case that you do have developments that come online that are, for example, providing an immense amount of parking and might not necessarily be meeting some of the other city's goals. Strategy 5 has to do with updating just EV and disabled accessible parking requirements. So the electric vehicle charging in the city is more or less already in compliance with Cal Green building standards. And I think many people are already familiar with ADA requirements for off-street parking. We're noting as part of the plan that there are guidelines that are currently under consideration called the Public Right-of-Way Accessibility Guidelines, or PROWAG, because people love acronyms. PROAG has not been officially adopted by the Department of Transportation, but is anticipated to do so in 2025. And probably the most key component, or for the purposes of this plan, is that it finally sets out in very clear detail how many on-street accessible spaces are required, such that anytime a street is altered or changed, it has to be brought up to code to include those accessible spaces. We also recommend as part of the plan that the city explore requiring developers to pay for a share of these, the cost of the installation of these spaces. So that, if new development comes in and there are no ADA spaces on street, the developer would have to chip in financially to provide, for example, a van accessible space somewhere on that street where it makes sense. So moving on from the vehicle recommendations, we focus on the bike code recommendations. Sacramento has already a good, decent set of bicycle requirements, but there are some shortcomings to it. The design standards are not quite there. The code that was updated about 10 years ago specifically include many different types of land use categories, when in fact many of those land uses actually experience kind of similar parking, bicycle parking demands. And we also noted that the bike parking, that the requirements that are in there were sometimes below other peer cities, and also didn't really accommodate necessarily newer types of vehicles, right? 10, 15 years ago, a bicycle was a bicycle. And nowadays, there are larger e-bikes and cargo bikes and so forth. So with that, the new recommended bike parking requirements look exactly like this. So you'll see that in terms of how the zones break out in relation to the vehicle parking, the central city and transit-oriented developments are grouped together in one column, and the rest of the city, essentially outside of those areas, is another. And you can see, for example, how many, and these are again minimum requirements. So again, we're switching from maximum vehicle parking requirements to minimum bicycle parking, so that a multi-unit dwelling, for example, in the central city would be required to have 1.125 long-term bicycle parking spaces per unit, a long-term bicycle parking space being something that is normally off-street and secure, and 0.375 short-term. So short-term bicycle parking being like a bicycle rack, something that's accessible to visitors and other folks. As you can see from the table as well, there includes requirements for spaces that can hold cargo adaptive bicycles. One of the things that we heard from several stakeholders was that, our current bicycle parking oftentimes can't accommodate these different types of vehicles or bicycles, and also e-bikes as well, and making sure that there's charging infrastructure as appropriate. There we go. In addition, there are required amenities provided for certain uses. And again, these are kind of augmenting, I think, what's there already, but this is very common practice in many cities, especially for office and industrial use, for places where there's large numbers of employees, that you have a shower or showers or lockers there for their use. And so other recommendations included as well are to update the bike rack placement and design standards manual in the city code to make sure that all the exact types of racks and their placement and things of that sort are always being kept up with kind of the latest and greatest. So looking at the components of the short and long-term bicycle parking, looking at the wayfinding and signage about where that's located, about the accessibility of it, making sure it's actually at places where people can reach it. And I mean, both literally and figuratively, because there are some bicycle parking that is sometimes wall mounted, and that might not be necessarily accessible to everyone. and dimension requirements for those bicycle spaces as well, considering that the size of bicycles has changed over time, and we want to make sure that there's adequate spacing for it. So lastly, moving on to the parking management toolkit, and what this envisions is that is a kind of a little bit broader because it's not code. So the city currently has an effective parking management program in effect, and it addresses the needs of many different people, from employees to residents to visitors, patrons, and so forth. And it's effective, and it's always kind of ongoing and changing and improving. But it's largely focused right now in the central city. And most people I think here will kind of realize that when you're in the central city, you'll see more, for example, residential permit areas, you'll see more parking meters, you'll see more things that are done to help manage the parking supply, because there is a very intense demand in that area. Now that the city, though, Sacramento, has essentially eliminated minimum parking requirements, there's kind of an increased risk for potential issues for on-street parking. And so really it behooves the city to have better management so that developers who come in, who are, for example, providing little to no off-street parking, don't necessarily try to use public parking as their go-to, and essentially push all of their employees or residents or tenants on street as a substitute for that. And so what does this look like? One is to update the current residential parking permit program. The city has had this RPP program in effect for many, many, many years. And there are shortcomings to it. One of which is that there's kind of there's far more permits issued than there are really spaces available in some areas. And the pricing is not necessarily set to optimize or encourage people to use, for example, their own garages. So looking at, again, best practices from other communities, our recommendation really here is to slightly alter it here over time so that it can support a cost recovery structure. Right now, the city just basically takes it as at a loss right now. And to phase in pricing so that if you want to, for example, park one car on street, that comes at a cost. But if you want to park 4 cars on street and from the same household, that comes at an increasing price, simply because you're putting more pressure and taking up more on-street area. And also building in there other multimodal incentives so that if you are not going to take advantage of those parking your vehicles on street, that there are other multimodal incentives available to you. Looking also right now, the city has started implementing what they call the supplemental parking permit program. This is only right now being tested at a few locations in the central city. So really areas that are higher density, where you have, for example, multi-unit developments coming in, and the developer wants to provide less parking off-street, but the city is not allowing this a traditional RPP zone there. And instead they've established market rates by zone, so that if I'm a developer and I'm coming in and I want to allow my residents to park on street, as part of the SPP program, they would have to pay whatever the market rate is for that space on street. So it could be $260 a month. Now, because the value of those spaces in the central city are very high. And this kind of reflects the new market conditions for that area. Looking at the SAC Park meter program, again, I'm sure many people are very familiar with the SAC Park program and the meters that are largely located or exclusively within the central city. This is an option that obviously the city wants to weigh carefully, but be able to deploy parking meters where they need to be in areas of high demand, particularly in commercial areas, regardless of whether it's in the central city or not. Now, in areas where there's lots of available parking, those might not necessarily be needed, but in old commercial corridors, for example, in particular, where you have considerable amount of development and people who are occupying those storefront spaces, it could be a very valuable tool in being able to manage demand in various areas. Expanding other permit programs, regardless, there's different ones that the city currently offers right now, but you also could have it for permits for low-income residents or employees, and also being able to manipulate the parking permit programs to really maximize the use of publicly managed facilities that have, for example, capacity overnight. So there's a way to kind of tinker with the current programs that are out there right now to really better help people who are, for example, low income, or to better utilize spaces. Reinvest in parking enforcement services. One of the things that we heard from our community conversations and other stakeholders is that, right now, if people just follow the rules, we wouldn't have as many problems. And we've also heard from the city that simply there's just not enough funding to be able to have this level of enforcement out there. And right now, it's a very complaint-driven process. So oftentimes enforcement doesn't show up until someone actually calls and complains. And so the idea here is to do an audit and see if there actually is sufficient enforcement. We've heard no, but I think there should actually be a more kind of formal process for that. And if so, make it a consistent process and not complaint driven, so that there is actually a reliable parking enforcement throughout the city when it's needed and where it's needed. And the idea is that any sort of process like this wouldn't start out as like a punitive thing, right? The idea of enforcement is to help ensure compliance, not kind of a gotcha thing. So it's really intended to roll out, hopefully kind of smoothly. Oftentimes communities will do this. Maybe they'll start out with warnings and then really increase the enforcement. Expanding on-street car share parking. So car share vehicles have had definitely their ups and downs in many American cities, and it's been very challenging for them to succeed financially. It's just very hard for them to pencil out. One of the ways that the city could try to encourage more car share operations in the city is to really expand their on-street spaces and those availability. It really makes it much more attractive for a car share provider to come back to Sacramento, particularly in the central city, and provide better service in those areas. So having them spaces in convenient spots, having charging access, having appropriate wayfinding, and so forth. And lastly, it's about implementing context-sensitive mobility hubs. So you might ask, what is a mobility hub? But they're essentially a kind of consolidated location for travelers to connect between different transportation modes, whether you come in via transit and you're able to easily shift to a bicycle, or able to shift to a scooter or carpool, or whatever the case happens to be. Right now, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, or SACOG, has been working on their mobility hub design guidance. And our recommendation to the city is, hey, they're doing a lot of the legwork right now and setting that up. Piggyback on that and go with what SACOG is recommending. These are the sorts of mobility hubs would probably be kind of slow to come online over time, and would probably be located in much more urban parts of the city, but it still can be an advantageous item to pursue to increase multimodal transportation across the board. All right. And with that, I think we can turn it over for questions and answers.
Well, thank you, Brian. That was really, really great. Super informative. Yeah, with that, we have left the rest of the time for just a really general question and answer session. And so there's a couple of ways we can do this. We would love to see some questions come through the chat box. So in the toolbar, either on the bottom or the top of your Zoom, you should see a chat box. You can ask questions there. If I get crickets, I might ask some people if they want to raise their hands and come unmuted and can chat with us. Again, we have plenty of time, but I think the big thing, yes, Chris, this slide deck will be made available. We're going to put it on the project website along with the summary and the meeting video as well. And again, we just want to make sure that everyone has the link to the Conveyo page, because the more comments that go there or directly to staff will be the most beneficial to this. All right, Dan has a great question. The project as presented doesn't seem to include the city's response to AB 413 daylighting requirements. Why not?
Why not? So absolutely familiar with it. So just so everyone's kind of on the same page about what AB 413 is and daylighting, the state recently passed a new law that essentially prohibits on-street parking within 20 feet, for example, of a stop sign on the approach side of it, such that it improves visibility for motorists to be able to see bicyclists and pedestrians before they get to the intersection, and can reduce collisions. So it's a significant safety improvement. So we haven't highlighted necessarily as part of this plan every single state law that's been out there. That's really, and again, this is state law, regardless of what we say in the plan, we can certainly reference it. But we've kind of more or less left this sort of thing to Public Works and the city to implement because it is a state law and not necessarily governed by what we're covering here. So yeah, I don't know if Stacy or Public Works wants to chime in with any more details on that.
Hi, everyone. Stacy Hovermel, Parking Manager for the City of Sacramento. And Brian, I think you touched on it accurately. This is a state law that is to improve traffic visibility and safety in the intersections. So I agree that it is important, but not necessarily something that we need to include in our strategies and our toolkit moving forward.
Great. All right. Thank you both. Brian, do you have anything else you wanted to add, or you're good?
No, it's a good question. A lot of communities are kind of struggling with this law, I'll be honest, because it means restriping huge swaths of the city. And it's a challenge, but it's also definitely a positive thing for vehicle, pedestrian, bicycle safety.
Great. Julia had a great question. It seems like she's struggling with some of the bike racks at one of her healthcare facility buildings. Is there anything that she can do, or this might be a question more for the city, to help report about maybe some unusable or unsafe bike racks, and maybe can suggest some updates?
Well, so
311?
I'm sorry?
Is that a 311 call? I'm not
311.
sure on the city side on how they would report that.
Yeah, so I'll offer a two-part answer to that. Because it has come up before in some of our community conversations and stakeholder feedback, hey, can we set requirements for existing uses? And the answer, unfortunately, really is no. I mean, projects that have been entitled, that are existing and they're currently in place, it's very difficult. I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it's very difficult to levy new requirements on them. That said, that existing bicycle facilities, just like any facility, has to be in compliance with whenever they were built. And if something is out of compliance, I'm sure you could actually report that to the city. So if there were a healthcare building and they had bicycle parking there and it was not in compliance, that would be something that could be reported. And just like any other compliance issue with the city.
Great. Thanks, Brian. All right, Slava's joining us from Arden Arcade. Arden Arcade is unincorporated, but will any of that be coming to that neighborhood?
So this is only within the city limits. So anything outside the city limits is county land or another incorporated city. So yeah, it's a different entity.
Great. Thanks for that clarification. And then going back quickly to AB 413, Kendra's asking, is the city planning on proactively implementing any of those? So for example, is there a plan to paint new red curbs and to place signage? She thinks that would be a huge safety win to be able to do that.
I think, yes, Stacey.
Yeah, hi, I can jump in on this one. So everything that happens for traffic visibility, traffic safety comes out of the city's transportation division under the Department of Public Works. They are actually in the process of, they're preparing an RFP for a consultant to start this process. So there are no work orders in for red curbs, but they are in the process of getting this program started.
Great. I know that will be encouraging for a lot of people who want to see that. This is something that we're hearing a lot in a lot of our community meetings, and especially with what went through council last night. So Tori is asking, how is the city going to safely incentivize more cycling when Sacramento right now is proving to be a little bit dangerous for pedestrians with some of the highest pedestrian deaths?
Right. So this study, one of the this study obviously is limited in its scope. It's not a complete street study. It's not a traffic circulation study. It's really intended to handle primarily changes to the city's code in relation to vehicle and bicycles, as well as the parking management aspect of it. So absolutely, I mean, safety is absolutely critical. Again, that's not something I think we can cover in too much great detail as part of what we're doing. We can provide, for example, and encourage bicycle parking facilities that are in safe areas and are located appropriately. We can have parking management that takes that into account. But at the end of the day, these sorts of safety issues are really being handled, I think, as part of other efforts by the city, as part of complete streets projects or otherwise.
Great. Thanks, Brian. So Nick has a great question. So he's asking us, how do we think about the value of providing parking versus alternative uses like housing, outdoor dining, or bike lanes? He believed, one of the silver linings coming out of 2020 was some of the parklets that have now been retrofitted back into some parking spaces. And so how do you value that, Brian, when you look at that?
I value that. I think it's really more about how the city values that. I don't know, Vic, did you want to, I see you unmute.
Feel free to start, Brian, and I'll jump in after.
Okay, sure. So part of what this project is really about, again, is pushing and helping encourage and supporting the city's goals for things like housing affordability and sustainability. Providing parking off-street represents a substantial cost of new residential and non-residential development. And there's great data going back to even the 1960s, showing how minimum parking requirements have influenced the cost of housing, for example. So the idea here is to still provide flexibility for developments coming forward, because we do understand there's a market demand and there's a housing element, and Sacramento is very much a pro-housing city. And we want to have policies and recommendations that support that and the creation of new housing, while also kind of encouraging folks to provide less parking, because frankly, that helps create more affordable housing. It creates more opportunities for walking, biking, and taking transit. So that's kind of the off-street piece of it. I would say kind of the reference to the outdoor entertainment areas and the parklets, one of the areas that, is important to consider as part of the parking management toolkit, and what the city is thinking through, and I'm sure Stacy stays up nights thinking about this, is what is the highest and best use for the city's curbs, right? So traditionally, curbs, I would say traditionally as in past 60, 80 years, cities' curbs have been really thought about parking cars. That's like default. People automatically go towards parking vehicles. And one of the things that we heard from a couple of folks in our working groups is that the curb space should not always be seen as places for vehicle storage. That was the term used. And that there are other things that can be used for the curbs, including parklets. It could be bicycle parking. It could be street trees or street furniture, and kind of rethinking how some of these public areas are used. And again, that will be very context sensitive. So it will vary based on the location, density, and design of the area. But I know that's something that is on the city's radar as well. Vic, anything you want to add?
Yeah, just briefly, and I'll just say you covered that very well, Brian. Thank you. And I'll just note that really the parking strategy, we're, as Brian noted, being conservative so that we don't inhibit good development coming into this through parking maximums, but really looking at that as a tool that can be modified going forward as our city. It's part of a larger suite of policy through the general plan, climate action adaptation plan, and our housing element that's really looking at creating a denser central city, denser transit-oriented development along our transit corridors. And so moving all of those pieces together enables us to look at through the policy implementation, looking at creating a context where future parking lots are instead able to be developed as housing or other beneficial land uses rather than parking. So creating that urban form and urban fabric that's going to support active transportation and transit choice increasingly over time in the city, and reducing the unnecessary overhead. But we do want to remain grounded in current demand and current needs for development in the city. And so being respectful and ensuring that we don't inhibit positive residential development in particular in the city through overly stringent parking maximums. But that's something that we'll continue to refine over time in coordination with other policy efforts.
And I'll actually just chime in with one last thing too, if I wasn't specific about this before, but one of the key stakeholder groups, sorry. One of the key stakeholder groups that we met with throughout the process were the development community. So we have one of our sub-consultants, strategic economics, we specifically had them on board because we felt it absolutely necessary to understand, I'm sorry, excuse me, how, okay, there we go, how parking and housing go together in the city of Sacramento specifically. So we talked with not only developers, but also lenders, for example, because oftentimes development projects are dictated and the parking ratios themselves are dictated by what lenders are willing to finance. And so we really went through and vetted these numbers continually with those folks to see, would they be feasible or not? How do they vary in the central city versus other parts of the city? How do they vary when you do it by different types of bedrooms, for example? How does it vary between market rate and below market rate housing? So the idea here is, again, to encourage lower parking provision. And I'll be honest too, many of the developments that have been approved or built in the city in the past 5 years are actually well below the maximums that we are proposing. So again, as Vic said, we're definitely erring on the side of making sure that we're not trying to in any way discourage housing through parking maximums and really kind of nudge it in the right direction. But I know it'll be something on the city's radar moving forward too, and looking at future data.
Awesome. Thank you both for the great answer. So Kendra has a great question about enforcement. So as part of the changes to the parking enforcement, are there going to be any specific plans to better educate the enforcement officers, maybe to update the 311 reporting options to increase some pedestrian and bicycle options? She feels it's currently extremely difficult to get enforcement officers enforcement to incur when something like a car blocks a crosswalk or a bike lane. There's no reporting option on 311 for things like this, and enforcement officers often note that no violation has been found when these types have been recorded. So is part of this any updates to the 311 and any of your enforcement systems?
Yeah, and hi, Kendra, I can speak to that. So we work with our parking enforcement officers regularly to do trainings and updates. We are actively hiring new parking enforcement officers to help fill some vacancies within the division. And we work with 311 regularly to make sure that the customer experience is what we want it to be. And so as soon as I saw your comment, I went right to my app on my phone, and sure enough, there's no drop down for blocking sidewalk or crosswalk, which it's impossible to get every violation, but those are important ones. And so we can definitely get those added to the app. That's a pretty easy fix that I can take care of. But one of the things that I just wanted to mention too is oftentimes the cars that are blocking crosswalks or parked up on a sidewalk or blocking a driveway, they're typically in and out and there for short amounts of time. So sometimes our parking enforcement officers, they have a large area that they're patrolling. It could take them 15 minutes to get to respond to that complaint. And oftentimes those vehicles have moved. So I think by cleaning up 311 and making those options drop down and easy for customers to use, talking with the enforcement staff, we can definitely help with that.
Awesome. Yeah, Stacey, I'm sure it's always a continual process. And like you said, probably can't catch everything, but it's always good to get great feedback from community members. Thanks, Kendra. Appreciate that. So Maria, it looks like someone needs to send Maria an invite to tonight's active transportation workshop as well, because I think she might have some good feedback for them. But she's asking who's going to address safety issues when they encourage more walking and biking, especially in the central city. She and her husband live in Midtown. They do a lot of walking and feels it's dangerous from both the aspects of both bicycles and cars. And so the reason why I started that question off is tonight the city is having a virtual workshop for their Streets for People, for their active transportation plan. It'll be a great time when they're talking about how best to create a safer network of walking, biking, rolling around the central city. And so I don't know if we have anything to add, Vic or Brian, here on our end here, but I just wanted to add that there is an opportunity for people to add on that project tonight, which will be talking exactly on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, oh, sorry, go ahead, Vic.
Yeah, no, I would just agree. I think that's the right place to look, and just to, just again, kind of note that the parking strategy is one piece of the larger suite of policy direction that the city is implementing, and we need to move all these pieces together. And we understand that they all relate together, and so we're doing our best at staff level to ensure that these implementing plans really communicate with each other well, and that we're moving forward in lockstep across these different policy directions. So, great question. Thank you.
Thank you all. So Eugene's asking if we could help illustrate the proposed unbundling provisions would work. If a parking is unbundled, would public parking in private facilities increase? Who would manage those parking spots?
Excellent question.
Yeah.
So it actually will vary significantly based on the development. So oftentimes what happens is the developer will come in, and I'll use a residential development in this case, and they'll have, 100 units, 100 residential units associated with it. They will do their darndest to try to construct whatever amount of parking they think will actually be leased or used by those units themselves. So let's say it's, 100 parking spaces, and those spaces would be unbundled at the end of the day. Let's assume for a second that they do that, and maybe there is some excess parking left over. Maybe only 80 of the spaces are used and there's 20 left over. At that point, the development has an incentive then to either try to lease those spaces either internally first and then externally thereafter. And that actually happens relatively often. Now, again, because these are often implemented in residential developments, they'll try to look for other nearby residents or people who can kind of respect the security of that development for it to work. It also kind of puts a little bit of an emphasis on the developer not to oversupply parking, because frankly, developers don't like, and people who manage these buildings, frankly, don't like to try to manage and sell and lease these sorts of spaces. It's a bit of a hassle for them. So it does kind of act as an incentive to be able to do that. I lived in San Francisco for many years. I don't live there anymore. But vast majority of the rentals, for example, in San Francisco are all unbundled. It's a very common practice that you see in many areas. The unbundling law that's taking effect, AB 1317, isn't only for Sacramento. It actually covers about half the state's population. For some reason, they kind of selected about 10 very populous counties to go with. So again, it's a very common practice. It's taking hold more, but there is a certain amount of kind of upkeep that comes with it. But it certainly has shown to be effective in actually reducing housing costs for people, and also reducing vehicle ownership in certain areas, because it actually leads to a better self-selection.
Awesome. So I want just to acknowledge Karen's comment about enforcement and red light cameras, and if they are in use. It's a little bit outside the scope of this project here, but I don't know if anyone from the city knows if there are red light cameras currently in use in the central city. I'm not sure. And again, that's a bit outside. We're here again talking about the parking and the policy updates here today, but again, lots of different discussions happening in lots of different parts of the city. But let's move to Chris. So Chris wants to discuss a little bit more about the plan to limit residential street permits, and the phase in charging to residents for those types of permits.
Sure. So the plan right now, and again, we just have a recommendation in the plan. It will be ultimately have to be carried out by Parking Division and other relevant city departments. But the idea here is to go to at least kind of a cost recovery model for the city, and one that limits the number of permits, but not necessarily to a point where, for example, you only get a single permit, right? So the idea here is that you create a system where, I believe in our recommendations, I have to go back, I think it goes up to 4 permits per household. And even at that point, the cost of these permits are relatively modest on an annualized basis. Even compared to, we look at a lot of other peer cities around the country, have these RPP programs and they price accordingly. And what we find when you implement these sorts of changes is, people are less apt to, park most of their cars on street. This happens very frequently in most of the jurisdictions we work with, that if you do have an RPP program where you're issuing a lot of free permits, it doesn't really solve the parking problem on street. It ends up being kind of a license to hunt for a space, oftentimes in many places, because people know that they can park their vehicles or store their vehicles on street rather than using their garages. So the idea here is to kind of incentivize that use of your own space before parking on street. How that gets phased in, ultimately, I can't necessarily say. We're only making the recommendation right now about kind of what a general structure would look like for the program.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. All right, so Dan has another question. Does this project address parking at bus stops? He believes some bus stops are not marked with the red curbs or signs. Some are long enough to accommodate the buses. Are we looking into bus stops?
No, this isn't necessarily a how do I say this? A streetscape plan in that way, right? So we're not necessarily dealing as part of this project about all the different on-street parking management, especially on a use by use basis. So this is a very broad, kind of high level project. But if there are bus stops out there that are having issues because people are parking in them, then I think that would be something that one of the relevant city departments could handle.
Awesome. Another question, does the cost recovery for residential include the cost of providing the road infrastructure for the parking lane or the maintenance of that space?
No, it does not. So the cost recovery that we're talking about is really more about the staff time and resources it takes to manage the program. If the city said, hey, for us, cost recovery is really more than about that, then absolutely the cost of these permits could be reevaluated. We try to really set it just kind of on a basic level, just to cover what the city is kind of currently spending. But there are absolutely jurisdictions throughout the country that price residential permits in terms of a broader sense of what it costs the community, or what it the value of those spaces themselves. So there's different ways to cover it, but again, our cost recovery is just focused on staff time and resources.
Awesome. All right, just checking in on time. All right, well, feel free, keep asking any questions. We have about another half hour here. We ended our presentation a little bit earlier. Brian, you went through it pretty fast here.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, I was
expecting a little bit longer, but it's all good.
And
Again, if we don't have questions, we can end early, but I want to give it a few more minutes in case if there's any more questions. If anyone's burning desire to raise their hand and chat with us, feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you. But again, it's, we're here just to answer any questions. Maria asks if we made any recommendations about which streets in Midtown could get parking meters.
So again, that's a level of detail that this study is really not getting into. I understand when we start talking about parking, people are like, what do you mean about parking? Is it about these spaces or is it a higher level? This study is really more kind of 30,000 foot level. But the idea here is that we want to, as part of the parking management toolkit, to give city staff the flexibility to implement various parking management measures where they're needed and when they're needed. So for example, parking meters, if you likely have, commercial areas in particular where you have high parking occupancies that are not being adequately addressed through time limits, that the city staff will be empowered to come in and say, yes, we can put parking meters in this area because it actually will encourage the sort of turnover that we're looking for. But again, this in order to figure out exactly what streets those are and where they are, takes, frankly, either a whole nother project or city staff working and looking diligently at the data.
Awesome. All right, we got another couple of good questions from Chris and Melissa in the chat box. So first from Chris, can we go into a little bit more detail about under what circumstances a developer would have to put in an ADA accessible space on the street?
Sure. So this is right now, I mean, and again, this is a public review draft, so obviously we can still change it. But right now, the way that we have the report structured is we say the city should explore having having developers chip in a certain amount to pay. That could take a few different forms. It could take, you could have a developer contribute financially only when the street itself is altered. So if I'm a developer coming in, but I'm not making any changes to the street, then I wouldn't contribute anything. That's one option. Another option is that if I'm a developer and I'm coming in and I'm providing no off-street parking, that I should contribute to the street because there's kind of an understanding that people will continue to drive and park at this development, and that an accessible space may be needed and very, very likely going to need to chip in. Or the city could say, you know what, regardless, even if you even if you are, providing a few spaces off street, we still want you to chip in and bring our streets up to code. And really go with whatever Department of Transportation accepts from the PROAG guidelines. So it's a little bit flexible right now, but if people do have thoughts on what they think the city should require of developers, then absolutely, give that feedback, go to Conveo, put it in there. We'd love to hear from you.
Great. Melissa has a great question. Can we give an example of how bicycle parking and types would increase for a new, let's say, Trader Joe's or a co-op, if car parking might be more restricted? It might be very helpful to see examples of how this plan, when implemented, would look in a real life scenario.
So one of the exercises that we actually went through with the city just internally was comparing, for example, existing bike parking requirements and future ones to show kind of how these things would change over time. That's the sort of thing that if I know, Melissa, if you're looking for that, I'm happy to share it with you one-on-one. We can also, if that's something that people would like to see in the report, we can include that too. I can't say off the top of my head, for example, for a Trader Joe's or a co-op, how it compares to the old requirements. I can say, though, that we never lowered requirements from what they were before. In many cases, we increased them. So I just don't know off the top of my head for that particular use. I do know, for example, for residential uses, it was definitely, increased in many circumstances, but for a Trader Joe's, I can't say, but I'm happy to provide that information if you're looking for it.
It looks like she is. So I'm sure you guys can connect. Brian, if you need Melissa's contact information, just let me know. I think you have it.
Yep.
But yeah, again, I'm sure it would be helpful for her to see some examples. Trina has a clarifying question. Is this primarily to address the central city or midtown, or does this apply to other areas of the city, north of the river, south of the central city?
So I'm still sharing my screen, correct?
Yes, you are. You can go back to the.
Yes, I will. Let me go back to the map.
Yes, that's what I was thinking. You could go back and show.
Great minds think alike, Katie. I'm glad.
Of course, right? That's why we keep the presentation up so we can refer to some
Exactly.
things.
Especially when we're so modest.
I know, right?
So here's the map again of what we're proposing for the zones for vehicle requirements and bicycle parking requirements. So right now, the way the general plan direction is to establish only vehicle maximum requirements within a half a mile of essentially high frequency transit. So the vehicle maximum requirements would only take effect within the central city and in these kind of orangish reddish areas that could be revisited over time and be expanded for the rest of the city, depending on how the city wants to proceed policy-wise. Bicycle parking requirements, the minimums, would be citywide, and they would be higher requirements within these kind of reddish zones, but there would still be minimum bicycle parking requirements elsewhere in the city, whether you're north of the river and you're up in the Thomas or wherever the case happens to be. The parking management toolkit is very much a citywide thing as well. So it's really about taking a lot of the great tools that the city is currently deploying in the central city and making better use of those in other parts of the city, particularly as new development occurs, such that so that a new development doesn't decide, I'm just making this up, but a new development is built down somewhere on Stockton and they don't provide parking, that it doesn't necessarily become, a massive overflow of resident vehicles on street who are looking for free spaces. And I should note too that this is particularly relevant given the recommendation in law to unbundle parking pricing. If I'm a developer coming in and you're telling me I have to charge, I build 100 units and I have to charge for those spaces and I'm going to charge $150 a month per state law, my residents have an active incentive to go looking for free on-street parking if it's available. And the city really needs to position itself well to be able to say, nope, this is a public good. We're not giving it away for free simply because you don't want to pay for an off-street space. And so I just want to kind of break into 3 tiers because this is a citywide study, but some of the recommendations, like the vehicle maximums, are restricted to certain areas.
Awesome. Thanks, Brian. So Natalie had a great question. Are there any details on encouraging underground structure parking instead of street lots as a way of promoting density and walkability?
It's not currently in there, but if that is something that you feel strongly about, that there should be incentives to try to encourage those types of parking, and particularly in denser areas like Central City, we definitely love to hear from you. It's something that certain jurisdictions do have built it into their codes. In this particular circumstance, we didn't put it in initially because oftentimes within the Central City in talking with the developers, we felt that the economics would kind of work itself out because the land values within the Central City are becoming high enough now that they'll actually want to do structured or underground parking simply because it pencils out. It makes more sense for them to build the density and have structured parking than still rely on surface lots. But again, if it's something that you say, gosh, we're not doing a good enough job on, we really need to push this, we'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Great question from Ron. Can higher bicycle parking requirements be extended and enforced around bike trails? For example, like the new Del Rio Trail.
Possibly. So the bicycle, I'll just be kind of make sure I'm also understanding the question. So the bicycle parking requirements that we have in here are for new development, right? So anywhere there is a new development that's built, they would be required to provide that minimum amount of bicycle parking, both long-term and short-term, et cetera. So there could be revisions, for example, to this map where we say, gosh, new uses that are located near bike trails like the Del Rio Trail might have higher bicycle parking requirements than somewhere else in the city. That's absolutely feasible. We had simply structured it in this way for kind of ease and also to really focus on the parts of the city that are anticipated to have more significant development and growth. But it's certainly something that could happen.
Awesome. All right. Going to pause here for a moment, see if there's any more questions, but maybe Brian, you can go to the next step slide and we can just have that up. And we can start to speak to, I know that Felix has been dropping in the chat the link to the Conveo page and where people can find this draft plan to make their comments. But while we're asking for any last questions, we might want to guide them on some of the next steps.
Vic, did you want to chime in here?
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Thank you, Katie. Yeah, so just wanted to walk you through our next steps on the project. In addition to this meeting, the city will be hosting a second virtual community meeting at 5:30 tomorrow evening. So I do want to note that this second workshop will present the same material as today's meeting, but it's intended to give folks a second opportunity in case they weren't able to join at this time. And then comments on the parking strategy will be accepted through December 2nd. The city will then take the input received from the public and 3 city commissions to guide revisions as we prepare the final draft parking strategy, which we will then take to the Active Transportation Commission, the Planning and Design Commission, and City Council in early 2025. Staff will then prepare implementing revisions to the Sacramento City Code later in 2025, following City Council approval of the strategy. Just to note, you are welcome to submit comments throughout the review process through council approval, but strongly encourage folks to provide comments in the Conveo online workshop and/or through the project email address prior to December 2nd, because we will have a focused effort to package up comments, respond to those, and really start an intense process over the subsequent following weeks to package up our final draft recommendations. And if you could go to the next slide. And so again, in addition to the online community workshop, you can reach the project team at this email address, parkingrevisions@cityofsacramento.org. And again, to note, the public review draft parking strategy and other project background and documents are available at the project website listed here, cityofsacramento.org/parking-revisions. And we'd like to thank you all for your time, interest, and attention today. We look forward to receiving additional comments to help us refine our recommendations as we prepare that final draft parking strategy for council approval. So thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Wonderful. Yeah. And again, Felix is putting some of the contact information and some of the Conveo links into the chat box. And if there's no other questions, I'm happy to give you guys a few more minutes back into your busy schedules. But that's really it for us here. But if you have any other questions, feel free to throw them into the chat box. But if not, we're going to wrap this all up probably at 11:15 here. And so again, we'll just keep it open for the last few minutes in case there's any few questions. But again, as Vic said, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Again, we'll have another evening session. So in case anyone needs to join us at the evening tomorrow night, starting at 5:30. And yeah, again, get your comments into the Conveo by December 2nd. It'll be super important that we get as many comments as possible. And then if you have any other direct questions or comments, feel free to reach out to the city directly. You can email us, you can reach out to us directly. We'd love to hear from you.
And I'll just say as a final note, thank you all for coming today. This has been great. Love the questions. And like Melissa asked for additional information, happy to provide that as necessary. If other folks have other questions that they want to raise, feel free to put it in the chat, send it to the email, put it in Conveo, whatever the case happens to be. We're here for you to provide the most accurate and best information we can. So, but thank you again for coming today.
All right. I thought we were going to take longer on our goodbyes and that we could stretch it. But again, yeah, thank you everyone for joining and for being a part of our working group meetings, our stakeholder meetings, our community conversations last year. Great questions that we've been getting as part of this process. And
I will just say too, I will be actually physically there next week at the Active Transportation Commission hearing. So come on by. You can see in person.
All right. Well, I will shut this down a minute early so we don't have to awkwardly look at each other. But again, thank you all for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. And we hope to hear from you all soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.